April 7, 1945. The sky above the Japanese home islands turned silver just after dawn. From horizon to horizon, a fleet of Boeing B-29 super fortresses droned northward at 25,000 feet, their contrails painting white lines across an otherwise empty blue canvas. But this morning was different from the hundreds of previous bombing missions that had struck Japan's cities since late 1944. For the first time in the Pacific War, these bombers were not alone. Above them, below them, and flanking their formations on every side flew a force of over 1,000 North American P-51 Mustangs, their silver wings glinting in the morning light like a metallic swarm. The fighters had launched from Iwo Jima, a blood-soaked volcanic island seized by American Marines just weeks earlier. The distance from Iwo Jima to Tokyo measured 660 nautical miles, a distance that Japanese military planners had believed impossible for any single-engine fighter to cover, escort heavy bombers throughout an attack, and still return safely. They had calculated the fuel capacities, analyzed the engine specifications, and dismissed the threat entirely. American fighters, they assured themselves, would never reach the sacred skies above the Emperor's palace. But on that April morning, as the roar of 12,000 Allison engines reverberated through the stratosphere, Japan's most fundamental military assumption shattered like porcelain on stone. The journey to that moment began not in the Pacific, but in the desperate skies over Nazi Germany 3 years earlier. In 1942 and early 1943, the United States Army Air Forces had committed itself to a doctrine that bordered on the suicidal: daylight precision bombing of German industrial targets without fighter escort. The theory held that formations of heavily armed B-17 flying fortresses, bristling with 50-caliber machine guns, could defend themselves through concentrated fire. The reality proved catastrophically different. German Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf fighters tore through bomber formations with impunity, exploiting blind spots, attacking from head-on passes that gave gunners mere seconds to respond, and retreating before escorts could react. On raids to Schweinfurt and Regensburg in August 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers in a single day, 600 men dead, wounded, or captured. On the second Schweinfurt raid in October, another 77 bombers went down. The mathematics were unsustainable. At such rates, bomber crews had less than a 25% chance of surviving a full tour of 25 missions. What the Americans needed was a fighter with impossible specifications, the range to accompany bombers deep into Germany, the speed and maneuverability to match the Luftwaffe's best interceptors, and the firepower to kill quickly in the fleeting seconds of air combat. Every aircraft was a compromise, a balance between competing demands. More fuel meant more weight. More weight meant less performance. Less performance meant death. British Spitfires could dominate dogfights, but lacked range beyond the English Channel. American P-47 Thunderbolts packed devastating firepower but consumed fuel at prodigious rates. The P-38 Lightning could fly far but struggled at high altitudes where bombers needed protection. None could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, until a Texas-born designer named James Kindleberger and his team at North American Aviation performed an engineering miracle that would alter the course of history. The P-51 Mustang emerged from an unlikely genesis. In 1940, the British Purchasing Commission approached North American Aviation with a request to build Curtiss P-40 fighters under license. Kindleberger countered with an audacious proposal. His company could design and build a superior fighter from scratch in just 120 days. The British, desperate for aircraft as the Luftwaffe hammered England, agreed. The resulting airframe was aerodynamic perfection, a laminar flow wing that sliced through air with minimal drag, a streamlined fuselage that looked fast even while stationary, and an engine cooling system that doubled as a source of thrust through clever thermodynamics. Early Mustangs, powered by Allison engines, proved exceptional at low altitudes, but struggled above 15,000 feet where the air thinned and most bomber combat occurred. Then came the marriage that transformed warfare. British test pilot Ronald Harker flew a Mustang in April 1942 and immediately recognized that its airframe deserved better. He suggested mating it with Britain's Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same power plant that drove Spitfires to victory in the Battle of Britain. American engineers refined the concept further, producing the Packard V-1650 Merlin under license. The combination was revelatory. The Merlin's two-stage supercharger gave the Mustang stunning high-altitude performance, while the efficient airframe stretched fuel economy to unprecedented levels. With drop tanks attached beneath the wings, the P-51D variant could fly an operational radius of 750 miles, enough to reach Berlin from England, fight for 20 minutes over the target, and return home. No other fighter in the world could match it. Beginning in December 1943, P-51s began reaching operational squadrons in England. The impact was immediate and catastrophic for the Luftwaffe. American fighters could now follow bombers all the way to their targets, engaging German defenders over their own airfields, destroying fighters on the ground, and turning the hunter into the hunted. The Mustang's 650 caliber Browning machine guns could pour 3,600 rounds per minute into an enemy aircraft, enough firepower to saw a fighter in half within 3 seconds. Its diving speed exceeded 450 miles per hour, fast enough to catch even Germany's jet-powered Me-262s in specific tactical situations. But more than raw performance, the P-51 brought operational flexibility. Unlike twin-engine escorts that required careful handling, the Mustang could dogfight with anything the Axis powers fielded. German aces found themselves outranged, outpaced, and overwhelmed by sheer numbers. By D-Day in June 1944, the 8th Air Force had achieved near-total air superiority over Western Europe. The Luftwaffe, once master of European skies, had been beaten into irrelevance. While Mustangs ruled over Germany, the Pacific War followed a different trajectory. Japan's geography presented unique challenges. American strategic doctrine called for destroying Japan's industrial capacity through sustained bombing, but Japan lay thousands of miles from any Allied base. Early raids launched from China proved logistically impossible. Every gallon of fuel, every bomb, and every spare part had to be flown over the Himalayas from India. The capture of the Mariana Islands in mid-1944 finally provided bases within B-29 range of Japan, but even from Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, Tokyo lay 1,500 miles away. The superfortresses could make the journey, but they flew alone and vulnerable. Japanese fighter defenses, though far weaker than Germany's, still took a toll. Without escorts, bomber crews faced psychological strain that bordered on unbearable. 12 hours over open ocean, half that time over enemy territory, with no help coming if engines failed or fighters attacked. Japanese military intelligence tracked American fighter deployments obsessively. They knew about the Mustang's success in Europe. They understood its theoretical capabilities, but they also understood physics. The distance from the Marianas to Tokyo exceeded the P-51's maximum range by hundreds of miles. Even if the Americans somehow solved the fuel problem, fighters would arrive over Japan with tanks nearly empty, unable to engage in combat without sacrificing their return flight. Japanese planners crafted their defensive strategy around this mathematical certainty. They positioned their best interceptor units, flying Kawasaki Ki-61s, Nakajima Ki-84s, and Mitsubishi J-2 MiZ, around critical targets, confident that American bombers would arrive unescorted. When B-29s did appear without fighter cover, Japanese pilots pressed aggressive attacks, sometimes deliberately ramming bombers when ammunition ran out. The kamikaze spirit extended beyond suicide planes. For Japan's defenders, the homeland's sacred soil could not be reached by enemy fighters. Geography itself was their fortress. Then the Marines landed on Iwo Jima, that sulfurous volcanic island, barely 8 square miles of ash and rock, lay exactly halfway between the Marianas and Japan. Its strategic value was incalculable. In American hands, Iwo Jima would provide emergency landing fields for crippled bombers and, critically, a forward base for fighter escorts. The Japanese understood this perfectly. They fortified Iwo Jima with 21,000 troops, 18 miles of tunnels, and orders to kill 10 Americans for every defender who died. The battle that followed, from February 19th to March 26th, 1945, became the bloodiest in Marine Corps history. Nearly 7,000 Americans died taking that island. 27 Medals of Honor were awarded, more than any other single battle in American history. But those deaths purchased something invaluable: the ability to project fighter power across the entire Western Pacific. Engineers from the Navy Seabees transformed Iwo Jima even while fighting continued on the northern end of the island. They carved airstrips from volcanic ash, built fuel depots, erected maintenance facilities, and stockpiled thousands of drop tanks. The logistics were staggering. Every gallon of aviation fuel, every spare engine, every bullet, and every wrench had to be shipped from Pearl Harbor or the West Coast. Yet within days of the island's capture, the first P-51s began arriving. Pilots found conditions primitive: tents instead of barracks, sulfur fumes poisoning every breath, and volcanic dust infiltrating every mechanism. But they also found themselves within range of Japan. The impossible had become routine. The 7th Fighter Command, operating from Iwo Jima, began planning maximum range missions immediately. The challenge was more than simple distance. Over open ocean, a single navigation error could mean death. Fighters carried no life rafts, and survival time in the cold Pacific waters was measured in hours. Weather fronts moved unpredictably, creating headwinds that could stretch fuel consumption beyond survivability. Engine reliability became existential. The Packard Merlin was magnificent, but 1,200 horsepower generated enormous heat and stress. A single failed cylinder at the wrong moment meant ditching in the sea with little hope of rescue. Pilots calculated fuel consumption to the ounce, leaned their mixtures to the edge of engine damage, and flew formation so tight that wingtips sometimes overlapped by mere feet, drafting off each other to save precious drops of fuel. In Tokyo, Japanese intelligence officers received reports of P-51s staging through Iwo Jima with disbelief bordering on contempt. The reports had to be exaggerated or misidentified. Perhaps these were P-38 Lightnings, twin-engine fighters with greater range. Perhaps they were Navy fighters on a suicide mission with no expectation of return. The idea that single-engine aircraft could fly 1,300 miles, fight over Tokyo, and return safely violated every calculation they possessed. Japanese pilots, briefed on the latest intelligence assessments, laughed at the notion. American fighters might reach the outskirts of Japan on drop tanks, but the moment combat began, they would burn through fuel and be forced to flee or die. The Imperial Japanese Army Air Force maintained its defensive posture, confident that mathematics remained on their side. March 1945 brought the first tentative probing missions. Small groups of Mustangs, flying at the edge of their range, swept toward Japanese-held islands south of the home islands. They encountered scattered resistance, shot down several obsolete fighters, and returned to Iwo Jima with fuel gauges hovering near empty. Each mission provided data: fuel consumption rates at various altitudes, optimal cruise speeds, the impact of combat maneuvering on range. Pilots learned to manage their aircraft with unprecedented precision, treating fuel not as a commodity, but as life itself. They discovered that flying at 25,000 feet in lean cruise consumed significantly less fuel than lower altitude flight. They learned that rapid climbs and dives in combat could drain tanks faster than sustained cruising. Every lesson purchased with nerve-wracking returns to base, engines coughing as the last vapors burned through carburetors. Then came April 7th, 1945, the first full maximum-range escort mission to Tokyo itself. Over 1,100 P-51 Mustangs, representing nearly every operational fighter the 7th Fighter Command could muster, launched from Iwo Jima in waves beginning before dawn. Each pilot carried a survival kit containing water, emergency rations, a .45 caliber pistol, and little else. The journey north took 3 hours, most of it over featureless ocean beneath unchanging skies. Radio silence was mandatory. Any transmission could alert Japanese defenses and compromise the mission. Pilots flew on instruments and dead reckoning, trusting navigation and the tight formations that kept them oriented. As the Japanese coastline materialized through haze, controllers scrambled interceptors from dozens of airfields around Tokyo. Japanese pilots climbed aggressively, expecting to find B-29s flying alone, as always. Instead, they encountered a sky filled with silver fighters. The psychological impact was devastating. Suddenly, Japanese interceptors were no longer hunting bombers. They were fighting for their lives against opponents who enjoyed numerical superiority, better training, and aircraft that could outperform nearly anything Japan fielded. Kawasaki Ki-61 pilots, flying excellent fighters that might have competed on equal terms in 1942, found themselves facing an enemy 3 years more advanced. The Mustangs dove through Japanese formations, their speed advantage turning engagements into fleeting snapshots where split-second decisions meant survival or death. Above this maelstrom, the B-29s proceeded to their targets almost unmolested. Japanese interceptor pilots faced an impossible choice: pursue the bombers and expose themselves to Mustangs diving from above, or engage the escorts and allow the bombers free passage. Most chose survival, breaking off attacks the moment American fighters appeared. Those who pressed through were cut down with brutal efficiency. Mustang pilots, confident in their fuel reserves and aircraft performance, could afford to be aggressive in ways Japanese defenders could not match. The mathematics that Japanese planners had relied upon, the calculations that promised safety through distance, had been rendered obsolete by American engineering and determination. The symbolism was not lost on those who witnessed it. For years, Japan had relied on distance and geography as shields. The vastness of the Pacific Ocean had been Japan's moat, protecting the homeland from enemies who lacked the reach to strike back. That sense of security, carefully cultivated by military propaganda, disintegrated in a single morning. If American fighters could appear over Tokyo itself, then nowhere was safe. No city, no factory, no military installation lay beyond American reach. The psychological blow struck deeper than any bomb. Japanese civilians, watching silver aircraft wheel overhead in impossible numbers, understood that their government's promises of protection were hollow. The divine wind that had supposedly saved Japan from Kublai Khan's invasion in the 13th century would not blow against these metal eagles. The mission's tactical results were significant but not decisive. 17 Japanese fighters destroyed against 7 Mustangs lost. But the strategic impact echoed far beyond those numbers. After April 7th, every B-29 mission to Japan could be escorted all the way to the target. Japanese interceptor losses mounted catastrophically as pilots were forced into defensive tactics that surrendered initiative to attackers. Fuel shortages, already critical, became catastrophic as Japan desperately dispersed aircraft to bases beyond American fighter range, sacrificing operational flexibility for survival. Pilot training programs, already truncated by fuel scarcity, collapsed entirely. New pilots received perhaps 50 hours of instruction before being thrust into combat against American aviators with hundreds of hours and multiple kills to their credit. The quality gap became unbridgeable. The P-51's technical specifications tell part of this story. With 2 drop tanks, the Mustang carried 490 gallons of fuel, more than twice what a Japanese Zero carried. The Packard Merlin engine, refined through years of combat experience, delivered specific fuel consumption rates that allowed pilots to cruise for 8 hours if necessary. The laminar flow wing reduced drag by 15% compared to conventional designs, translating directly into extended range. Even small details mattered. The Mustang's bubble canopy provided unobstructed visibility, allowing pilots to spot threats earlier and maintain situational awareness during extended missions. Japanese fighters, many still using framed canopies that created blind spots, found themselves surprised and killed before recognizing danger. But numbers and specifications cannot capture the human dimension of these missions. Flying 7-hour missions over open ocean demanded concentration that bordered on superhuman. Pilots urinated into relief tubes, ate sandwiches with one hand while managing throttle and trim with the other, and fought off dehydration and fatigue that dulled reflexes. The cold at 25,000 feet penetrated flight suits despite layers of insulation. Ice formed on windscreens, forcing pilots to weave gently to peer around frozen patches. Radio silence meant isolation. 600 miles from friendly territory, surrounded by nothing but water and sky, each pilot flew alone within his formation, trusting that the man on his wing was as committed to survival as himself. And when they returned, fuel gauges often registered empty. Engines coughed and sputtered as pilots lined up for landing at Iwo Jima, vapor locks starving carburetors of the last remaining drops. Ground crews counted bullet holes, patched wings, and replaced engines at rates that astonished even veteran maintenance chiefs. Some Mustangs flew 6 days out of 7, accumulating combat hours faster than peacetime aircraft accrued total flight time. The logistics personnel who kept this machine functioning deserved equal credit with the pilots. Without their relentless work, none of it would have been possible. Japanese defenders adapted as best they could. They concentrated their remaining fighters around critical targets, accepting that most cities would burn undefended. They developed new tactics, attempting to bait American escorts into fuel-consuming dogfights that might leave bombers temporarily exposed. They even attempted kamikaze attacks against escorting fighters, a desperation move that succeeded only in wasting lives against opponents who could simply accelerate away. By May 1945, effective Japanese air defense had ceased to exist. American bombers ranged across Japan at will, burning cities with incendiaries, mining harbors, and destroying the last remnants of industrial capacity. The P-51's dominance extended beyond combat. Damaged bombers, crippled by flak or mechanical failure, could be shepherded home by escorting fighters who flew alongside, providing navigation assistance and moral support during emergency landings at Iwo Jima. Hundreds of bomber crewmen owed their lives to those silver escorts that appeared when engines failed over enemy territory, forming protective cocoons that saw them safely back to American bases. The sight of Mustangs joining formation became synonymous with hope, proof that help existed even in the most desperate circumstances. In later years, historians would debate the Mustangs' role in ending the war. Some argued that strategic bombing alone would have forced Japanese surrender. Others credited the atomic bombs or the Soviet invasion of Manchuria. But all acknowledged that the P-51's appearance over Tokyo marked a turning point. It demonstrated American industrial capacity, the ability to produce over 15,000 Mustangs while simultaneously building bombers, ships, tanks, and everything else modern war demanded. It showcased American innovation, the willingness to recognize a problem and engineer solutions regardless of conventional wisdom. And it symbolized American reach, the transformation of a nation that had been surprised at Pearl Harbor into one that could strike Tokyo with impunity. The Japanese pilots who survived these encounters carried memories that haunted them for decades. They had been told they were invincible, flying superior aircraft in defense of sacred homeland. Instead, they had been overwhelmed by opponents who controlled every aspect of combat, when to engage, when to break off, and where battles would occur. The psychological trauma of facing an enemy with such complete superiority left scars that no physical wound could match. Some refused to speak of their experiences for years. Others became vocal critics of the military leadership that had led them into unwinnable battles with false assurances and manufactured intelligence. As summer 1945 approached, the campaign intensified. Missions that once required maximum effort became routine. Mustangs began ranging beyond Tokyo, escorting B-29s to targets in Osaka, Nagoya, and Kobe. They strafed airfields, destroying parked aircraft and infrastructure. They shot down trainers attempting to evacuate student pilots to safer locations. The kill ratios became so lopsided that they lost meaning, 20 or 30 Japanese aircraft destroyed for every Mustang lost. Japan's Air Force existed in name only, a collection of dispersed survivors hiding from an enemy that appeared everywhere simultaneously. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 finally ended the war, but the groundwork for surrender had been laid by months of conventional bombing that the P-51 made possible. Japan's leaders, meeting in bunkers beneath Tokyo, understood that continuing the war meant watching their nation burn city by city with no capacity to resist. The Mustangs that droned overhead daily were not just weapons. They were reminders of helplessness, symbols of how completely the war had turned against them. When Emperor Hirohito finally announced Japan's surrender on August 15th, he cited the enemy's new and most cruel bomb. But the subtext was clear: Japan could no longer defend itself against any form of attack. The legacy of those silver fighters extends far beyond their combat record. The P-51 Mustang represented a philosophical approach to warfare that emphasized technological superiority combined with industrial capacity. Where totalitarian regimes like Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan relied on ideology, warrior spirit, and acceptance of casualties, the United States sought to minimize risk to its personnel through superior equipment. This wasn't mercy or weakness, it was calculation. A dead pilot represented thousands of hours of training wasted. A lost aircraft meant resources expended without return. By building fighters that could outperform, outrange, and outsurvive enemy opposition, America turned war into an equation it could win through mathematics rather than mythology. The engineering lessons learned from the Mustang influenced jet fighter design for decades. The importance of aerodynamic efficiency, the value of long range, the need for pilot visibility, all became standard considerations in post-war aircraft development. Jets like the F-86 Sabre, which dominated Korean War skies, incorporated design philosophies refined in the Mustang program. Even modern fighters owe intellectual debt to decisions made by designers who understood that performance meant survival. But perhaps the deepest impact was psychological. The appearance of Mustangs over Tokyo shattered Japanese assumptions about distance providing security. In an era before intercontinental missiles, the ability to project fighter power across thousands of miles of ocean represented a revolution in military capability. It demonstrated that America possessed not just industrial strength, but the logistical sophistication to deploy that strength anywhere on Earth. This capacity for global reach would define American military power for the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. On that April morning in 1945, when over 1,000 Mustangs escorted B-29s over Tokyo and returned safely to Iwo Jima, they proved more than tactical capability. They demonstrated that American engineering could overcome challenges that enemies considered insurmountable. They showed that careful planning and resource allocation could defeat numerically superior forces. And they revealed that geography, once an absolute barrier, had become merely another obstacle to be solved through determination and innovation. The Japanese pilots who mocked the P-51's range learned a lesson that echoed across history. Never underestimate an opponent's capacity for innovation. The Americans who designed, built, and flew those silver fighters achieved something remarkable. They took what their enemies considered impossible and made it routine. That transformation from fantasy to reality, from theoretical impossibility to operational necessity, defined American air power in World War II and shaped the world that followed. The sound of those Merlin engines, multiplied by 1,000, still echoes in memory, a roar that announced the arrival of a new era, where oceans no longer protected, where distance no longer defended, and where American resolve, backed by industrial might and technological superiority, could reach any target it chose. The pilots who flew those missions, many barely old enough to vote, carried with them the weight of a nation's expectations and the hopes of a world desperate for liberation. They delivered both, one escort mission at a time, until the only choice remaining to their enemies was surrender or annihilation. In the end, that is what the Mustang represented: not merely a fighter aircraft, but the physical manifestation of American power translated into aluminum, fuel, and firepower. It flew farther than physics suggested possible, fought better than experience predicted, and survived challenges that should have destroyed it. Like the nation that built it, the P-51 Mustang succeeded not through single attributes, but through the combination of countless advantages working in concert. Engineering excellence, industrial capacity, logistical sophistication, pilot training, tactical innovation, and unwavering commitment to victory regardless of cost. When the last mission ended and the final Mustang landed at Iwo Jima, their work was complete. They had carried American air power across an ocean, defeated an enemy that believed geography made them invincible, and paved the way for victory through dominance, so complete that resistance became futile. The silver wings that once seemed too delicate for such brutal work had proven stronger than the fortresses their enemies built from stone and steel. And the pilots who flew them, ordinary men asked to accomplish extraordinary things, had answered that call with courage that deserves remembering long after the last Merlin engine falls silent and the last veteran passes beyond memory into history.